Good evening and welcome. I am Alan D. Benson. The African American Initiative, known as AAI, is pleased to originate and co-host this summit on education censorship. As many of you know, AAI is a policy initiative organized in 2010, featuring a wide array of primarily African American stakeholders, leaders, and operatives that come together to discuss and address issues that confront the African American community. It draws its input from across Kentucky and the nation. It also is convened by a multitude of organizations that support this common objective. This summit will offer you a unique, unvarnished perspectives on how race continues to play a central role in how our nation works and why. Efforts at education censorship is not a new reality, whether a society reaction to issues related to religion, sexuality, as well as other issues, including this nation's racial history. We are pleased to co-host this event with the Louisville Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and Psi Boule, a Sigma Pi Phi fraternity. We are also pleased that we are continuing our collaboration with AARP Kentucky and WLOU, who is simulcasting this event at 1350 on your dial, as we stream on Facebook Live and later to be posted on YouTube. AAI wants to give special recognition to the National Black Caucus of State Legislators for their continuing work on the front lines of our nation's capitals, fighting the truth, justice, and equality. At this time, we will hear from the president of Delta Sigma Theta's alumni chapter, Ms. Rosalind Welch. Thank you.
Well, greetings, everyone. I hope you're having a great evening and staying warm as much as you can. My name is Roz Welch, and I am the president of the Louisville Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. And the Louisville Alumni Chapter is super excited to host this forum with you today. Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated has been working tirelessly for the last 108 years in the cause of equity and equality in our communities. Our focus on economic development, educational development, international awareness, physical and mental health, and political awareness and involvement continues to move us forward in this fight. Under the umbrella of political awareness and involvement, Delta uses its influence to enact laws and policies to expand the rights of citizenship and protect the vulnerable and unfortunate. Our mission, of course, is always to promote leadership, provide advocacy for issues and challenges impacting our community, raise awareness, and influence change. Addressing educational disparities and inequalities is a key focus area for our organization. We look forward to hearing the perspectives of the members of this renowned panel of experts as they shed light on how the subject of critical race theory is being used to divide us and minimize the importance of our history. Today, we stand with our partners to ensure that our history is not lost nor trivialized. In the spirit of Sankofa, as we move forward in this march, the knowledge of the past must never, ever be forgotten. So thank you for participating in this very important conversation today, and we can't wait to hear all that you are going to expound upon tonight.
Senator, you're muted.
So I should start again. I want to thank you, Roz and Alan, for your introductions. And also I want to welcome our viewing audience as well. It's a very important subject matter that we're going to deal with here tonight. And we have some very distinguished individuals that will be expounding upon these things from a position of knowledge and experience. So this is very important. I also have with me a co-host, a co-moderator in Dr. Julian Halley. And Dr. Julian Halley is a co-education chair of the Kentucky NAACP. Welcome, Dr. Halley.
So glad to join you and looking forward to having this conversation with our esteemed panelists.
Well, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate that fact. You know, critical race theory is an academic concept that is more than 40 years old. The core idea is that racism is a social construct and that it is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but also something embedded in legal systems and policies. The basic tenets of critical race theory, or CRT, emerged out of a framework for legal analysis in the late 1970s and early 1980s, created by legal scholars Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado, among others. It seems that this has been a topic that has been appropriated by those who might want to see this another way. And they have mischaracterized by many that are observing this what critical race theory is about, and have used it in a way that it has been used as a bludgeon, I should say, to advance the interests of those who want to censor education, particularly in this case, when it comes to the issue of race. So without me expounding further, we have individuals here today that can go very deep in this subject. I'm glad to have with us 3 individuals on this scholars panel. Our first panel, we will have 2 panels, and our first will be what we refer to as our scholars panels. And on this panel is Dr. Adrian D. Dickson, PhD, professor of critical race theory and education at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Also, she focused on intersectionality, among other things, of race, class, and gender in urban educational context. Welcome, Dr. Dickson. Also, we have with us Cedric Powell, Professor Cedric Powell. He's a professor of law at the Brandeis School of Law and University of Louisville. He is also on that not only that faculty, but he's a university faculty grievance officer at that particular university. And we're also pleased to have with us Katherine D. Brown, Dr. Brown, of the University of Texas at Austin. She is the Susan B. and John L. Adams Endowed Professor of Education, Distinguished University Teaching Professor, and Cultural Studies and Education, Department of Curriculum and Instruction, as well as African and African Diaspora Studies, and the College of Liberal Arts, as I've indicated, at the University of Texas at Austin. So thank you so very much. And we will begin with Dr. Dickson. I'm sorry, we will begin with Professor Powell. Professor Powell.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and privilege to be here with my esteemed colleagues, and thank you very much for this opportunity to offer some thoughts on critical race theory. The fact that we have these two panels really shows that this is a transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary discussion about critical race theory, where we examine the structures of inequalities in the system and processes that establish and maintain subordination of people of color.
Well, let's begin by getting your perspective on matters. First of all, what are the central tenets from your examination of critical race theory?
Well, there are many central tenets, but I think I can identify 5 that almost always come up in whatever way we conceptualize it. The first one is that race is ordinary and difficult to address because it is not acknowledged. Indeed, this attack on critical race theory is an example of that, because what people are really saying, not really even talking about critical race theory, we don't even want to acknowledge the existence of race and the present day effects of past discrimination. So racism is ordinary and difficult to address because it is never acknowledged. Another is interest convergence. There's little incentive to eradicate racism unless it aligns with white interests. Brown versus Board of Education is an example of this. You had the United States preaching about democracy and equal opportunity across the world during the Cold War period. And you have Russians saying, well, why are you preaching to us about democracy and freedom when you continue to subordinate African Americans and people of color? So Brown becomes a unanimous decision because of the Americans' diplomatic interests, and that is directly tied to white interests. So any achievements are incremental and secondary.
Well,
Race is social. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I cut you off just a minute. What I want to do is get a little bit of the perspectives from the other panelists, and we're going to come back and have a discussion about that.
Okay.
Dr. Dickson, it'd be interesting in getting your perspective on matters, particularly the work that you've been doing over a long period of time. Would you please give us some idea of the work that you're involved in, and what do you see in terms of what are the central tenets of critical race theory, and what does that mean and the value of that to us?
So, I mean, there's some agreement on kind of how we engage critical race theory in education. Or critical race theory. So I agree with my colleague, Cedric Powell, that we kind of agree on 5 central tenets. In education, what we've done is kind of taken cues from my colleagues in the law to look at kind of how particular practices and policies perpetuate racial inequality. And so we agree that racism is normal. It's not aberrant in American society, that in fact, most of our institutions are a reflection of white supremacist ideology that was designed to oppress particular groups and advantage others. And so, as that relates to education, certainly our legislators pass laws that then become an informed policy in education. We look at how those policies, even those that are supposed to be colorblind, actually perpetuate and exacerbate racial inequalities. I have looked at the classroom level primarily, and have since Hurricane Katrina kind of looked at how education reform policies exacerbate historical racial inequalities in the urban South. So after Katrina, education reform policies were introduced to supposedly eradicate historical racial inequality. And what we found that they actually have exacerbated them, and in many ways have expanded the reach of racialized educational inequality, and have kind of firmly kind of cemented particular practices that have reached across a number of domains. So from teachers, teacher training, teacher salaries, labor practices, access and enrollment in schools, funding of schools. So the ed reform policies actually didn't do what they argued that they would do. And that's kind of what I look at. And that is empirical, right? So we don't have to really argue about the impact and the effectiveness of education reform in New Orleans post-Katrina. We actually have the empirical evidence to show. And so that's the kind of stuff that I look at. And my colleagues, Kefferlin and Marvin and Julian, can speak to ways that they have been kind of engaged critical race theory to look at education policy and practice.
Yeah, you're using the empirical piece. So you're looking at facts, you're doing investigation, you're seeing how things are connected. So Dr. Brown, I'm trying to understand. It seems pretty obvious as to the way you go about investigating, trying to understand things. So why the controversy regarding critical race theory?
Well, I'm sure there's a long answer that could be laid out, but I think I'm going to just sort of say that this is not the first time that race or culture has been leveraged as a weapon, as a tool, often for political ends, to undermine in many ways some progress that might be made towards schools operating in a more inclusive and just way. We've had quite a few incidents over the last 5 or so years of very visible state sponsored violence, often in the form of police officers killing Black people and other people of color. And in those incidents, on top of, I would argue, COVID-19 and all of the other things that were going on in the previous presidential administration, that really sort of catalyzed folks in this country who had not really spent a lot of time thinking about race or racism, who didn't seem to know a whole lot about race and racism, that recognized they needed to learn more. And, in many ways, that sort of excitement on the heels of the 1619 Project and all of that brought to bear, really created a space where folks were asking questions. And as a result, there's been pushback. But that's what often happens when racial progress or seeming racial progress, or the belief that there's some racial progress that's taking place in society, there's a pushback. In some ways, I think that it's the social conditions that we've seen in our society that have helped to create this sort of pushback.
Well, thank you for those observations, but it appears now that this whole concept, or at least what people call critical race theory, it appears that most people I run into really don't know what it is. I guess because of the level and where it's really being taught, but yet those who would want to stifle education and the truth in education, the educational process, want to use it as the boogeyman now, rebranding it to undermine or justify not exploring the realities of our country and how the good and bad and the ugly, so to speak. So I'm going to yield to my co-moderator, Dr. Halley, to take it from here for a while, and let's see what else we can get out on the table.
Well, Senator Neal, it sounds like maybe, just maybe, this conversation about critical race theory in schools is not actually about critical race theory at all. It seems like it's actually about something else, because the concepts that my colleagues discussed are very complex concepts. I myself have used critical race theory in research, in fact, with Dr. Keflin Brown, who's a professor at the University of Texas, and just spoke to us. And these are very complex concepts that we're using in research in higher education. So I want to ask the panelists, we can just popcorn this. Do you think that critical race theory is being taught to kindergartners or third graders? And if it's not being taught at that level, why is it that people are saying that it is?
Hi, Julian, I'll jump in. And first, I am remiss by not acknowledging my SOAR president, Roz Welch. I should have done that at the beginning. And I'm so grateful that the Louisville chapter of Delta Sigma is hosting this event. Thank you, SOAR, for that wonderful introduction and welcome. It absolutely is not being taught in elementary school to young children. There is no curriculum that has been designed that's a critical race theory curriculum that is at the elementary level. And Keflin could speak to this. We can barely get ethnic studies curricula created and accepted. I mean, our colleagues in Tucson had issues at the K-12 level, just having a curriculum that was focused on Mexican-American, the Mexican-American experience in Arizona. So it is a myth, and it is, as the senator said, it's a proxy for other issues, and it is a smokescreen for other issues. We have people who can't feed their families, right? We know that there are serious economic issues. So they're just talking about inflation. Yesterday I was watching 60 Minutes. I mean, people can't afford housing across the country. So it's a smokescreen, but it's also a way of avoiding the kind of increasing diversity that we know it has been, that we know that we're experiencing since the late 90s, that that students of color will outnumber and are outnumbering white students in our schools. But interestingly, our teaching force hasn't diversified. So there are actually more white teachers, more white women teachers. So there's a demographic imbalance in our schools, but this is a way of kind of not addressing what we've called for over a decade now, the browning of America, and this real kind of fear about having to reckon with that people of color are now the numerical majority. And so how do we kind of maintain, how do particular groups maintain political, social, and economic power? Well, you create a boogeyman that doesn't really exist, but I'll stop there.
Yes, I guess I'll jump on. I think Adrian said it wonderfully. We're not finding that people are teaching critical race theory in schools. In fact, we believe that there needs to be more work done in schools to address racial inequalities, racial injustices, inaccurate, I won't say inaccurate, but not as inclusive of curriculum that we actually should have and need to have in schools. Critical race theory provides a way for us to better understand institutional forms of racism and how racism has played a role in our society, in our various societal institutions over time. That's what critical race theory does. It is not something that you would find in any standards. And even as there are people who are arguing that, okay, fine, it might not be taught or found in the curriculum or in the standards, it's still something that students are being taught. That frankly, I've not seen any indication of that. In many cases, teachers who might be interested in better understanding about race and racism, have to struggle in some ways. When I teach this in my graduate courses, students are trying to wrap their head around what are these ideas and how can they use it to better understand what's happening in our society. And so I actually would argue that the very visibility of critical race theory, or the belief that we need to help people to better understand it, is an indication that it's not what's happening in schools. It's not what's being taught in schools, and that what's found in the curriculum.
It seems like there's a real concern out there then that this conversation about critical race theory is about something else. And you see these sort of examples starting to come in from states where critical race theory has been banned. I've heard of faculty in Florida having conversations with deans of their colleges that there's too much equity in their courses. You hear about the teacher in Jacksonville who the state commissioner asked that she be suspended because she had a Black Lives Matter flag in her classroom. You hear about in Georgia, districts that are blocking access to curricular modules about the Holocaust, about Muhammad Ali, and other historical individuals. You hear about the principal in Texas who wrote a solidarity statement about equity, and he was fired for that. And so there's a concern. Are there other things that you're hearing out there that critical race theory bills are impacting conversations about equity in schools?
I think the best way to focus on this is to look at really the topic that we're talking about, and this censorship in the First Amendment. And I think that this current attack on critical race theory is part and parcel of the big lies and the maintenance of white supremacy. There is a public discourse going on that talks about an election being stolen. Voting irregularities means that we have to have audits to try and find some type of fraud. The criminalization of Black protests, Black Lives Matter as terrorists and insurrectionists as patriots, the politicization of mass mandates. Libertarianism means that everyone should be able to do what they want to and harm society and the communities. Equating any anti-racist work with being a racist, which is the ultimate type of deflection. And then finally, weaponizing the First Amendment as an attack on critical race theory, which is the biggest lie of all. And I think the goal is to create, maintain, and enshrine a celebratory story of whiteness, devoid of any mention of the complexity, nuance, and enduring effects of systemic racism and structural inequality. So if you look at those bills and legislation, they don't mention critical race theory. They mention things about sentiments, feelings, subjectivity, and stigmatization. There are memory laws designed to reformulate history. America really wants, I should say white America really wants, a history that is incomplete, that is revised, that does not mention any of the blemishes of American democracy and celebrates a linear history, all of good things and triumphs without any mention of subordination, racism, colonization, slavery, and many other things that have happened in American history. So we need a complete history. And I think that's what our discussion about curriculum has to be, a complete history so that school children receive a complete and critical education so that they can be the active and engaged public citizens that we all want them to be.
Well, let me step in there just for a minute, Julian, if I may. You made reference to these bills. There's over 27 states where this subject has found its way into legislatures, into bills, et cetera. In Tennessee, they passed it. I can name a list of them. Kentucky's considering this in its legislative session coming up in 22. So where, you mentioned the First Amendment. Where does the United States Supreme Court fit into this discussion?
Well, the Supreme Court has always been First Amendment absolutist. That is our real tradition. We believe in the marketplace of ideas. We believe that we should engage in these dialogues, that bad speech will be met by good speech and truth will win out if ideas participate in the marketplace. And so the Supreme Court has always protected free expression and noted that the state cannot control the content of speech. In fact, we use the highest level of scrutiny whenever the state is involved in manipulating what people can say and think. So the state is absolutely prohibited from even engaging in telling public school officials or schools what to teach. That's unconstitutional, and even conservatives believe that. And so it really shows the duplicity of this argument that now conservatives are weaponizing the First Amendment and making the argument that the state can control what goes into the curriculum.
Julian?
You know, I think this is a difficult question because as you look across the landscape of states, you see different implications for higher education than I think you see for K-12. In higher education, if legislation was to dictate curriculum, our accreditation could be at threat across the nation. And the Supreme Court has been very clear about the rights of faculty to free speech and academic expression. However, on the K-12 level, you do have some districts who have restrictive policies in terms of controversial issues and these other types of things. And that's likely because, you know, education in K-12 is compulsory. So I think one of the real challenges that we have here is the freedom of speech and the right to academic freedom of K-12 educators. And I think that's where you might see this Rosa Parks moment. Is the Supreme Court going to continue to allow this restriction of speech? I think that's an interesting question. But I have another question I want to ask folks, which is that, you know, we are working very hard to diversify the teaching profession. But what might that chilling effect be for our efforts to bring people of color into the teaching profession if they teach equity themes and their certification could be revoked, or they were fined $5,000? Do you think that it's going to make it more difficult for us to recruit teachers of color if they feel like that threat is hanging over their head? What do you all think about that?
I'll jump in here. I think, you know, we don't know what's going to happen, but if we take anecdotal sort of conversations, I know the ones that I've had and that others have had, it will have an effect. It will impact mainly teachers of color, I would argue, because there's already an assumption of guilt. Race is carried very differently on the bodies of teachers of color. And we make up such a few, you know, such a small percentage of the teaching population in general, that to have this happen could be catastrophic. I'm in the middle of doing a research project right now with a group of teachers where we're talking about how they approach the teaching of race. And I have had several teachers to say that they are getting targeted by administrators and others for the way that they're teaching. They don't necessarily know what they're doing in the classroom, but they assume, based on the teachers and certain commitments that they have tried to hold around helping students have develop critical thinking abilities and to make connections between what they're learning in school and what's going on in the larger world, which we know is effective and important pedagogical practice or teaching practice. So I think that it could definitely have a chilling effect, and perhaps that might be part of the plan itself.
So let's talk a little bit about the attack. Let's talk about the nature of the attack. We have a situation here that, as I listen to this, that they're using critical race theory, the name, not the concept necessarily, as a contrived dog whistle. They've taken this word and rebranded it, and now it's a dog whistle. It's a very complex discussion, as we can see from this right here. But guess what it does? And I want you to react to this, anybody. It's divisive. I'm talking about legislation that's on the books, and some have been passed in some of the states. Criminalizes teaching. It activates the education police. It focus on and inspires education suppression of bills. And it's big government. In fact, in my state, where Republicans control, they are advocating big government, where they, historically have said, hey, we're against big government, but they're coming in with this piece. I'm trying to understand from you experts, from you people that study this stuff, why is it that they're so able to redefine this conversation and use it against us in this way without what I consider a very focused response?
So I will see some of this. I want to respond, but I also think that my country probably have more to say on a legal end. But I think this is part and parcel. Carolyn spoke about this earlier. This has kind of been what the American response, right? This response, this suppression of any conversation about difference, about inequality, about white supremacy has always been squashed. I mean, from Reconstruction, right? This is a kind of typical pattern of behavior by our political elites, and it's a kind of typical strategy to garner more support and power, and so it's not surprising kind of how talk about kind of the racial boogeyman has been leveraged to suppress any free thought or any thought that is going to challenge the status quo. This is just what we do, and it often plays out in school. So all kind of efforts to squash social movements and organizing are launched in public schools, and so they bear the brunt of kind of these efforts to squash dissent, question, critique, etc.
Julian?
I think all that is really troubling. I think it's really troubling because if you look at authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, one of the first things that they try to do is squash dissent, especially in universities, squash free speech, especially in university settings. I just think that what you just said is just a really troubling development, because this is a conversation about not only K-12, but also higher education. And there's this sort of reaffirmation that educational spaces, especially higher education, is that place where difficult conversations happen in democracy, yet there are folks that don't want those conversations to happen. I think that is really the antithesis of freedom of speech and academic freedom. So I guess the follow-up question that I have is, a couple of years ago, Cufflin and I, Dr. Brown and I, did some work on textbooks and standards and the representation of people of color in that. Do you think that this movement is going to actually change the curriculum and perhaps make teachers, textbook publishers, people who write standards shy to include themes of equity to avoid charges of critical race theory, et cetera? Do you think it's going to change what's taught to our children by default?
Well, that remains to be seen. We have to see the extent to which these conversations will continue. And there's been, there was a report that came out in the New York Times maybe a week or two ago that made the argument that this particular concern, and that's being taken up across states, has become sort of a political rallying cry, right? And a way to sort of energize a base, right? When maybe there's not a whole lot else that you might be able to use. And so we'll have to see where it goes and how long it will last. Again, this isn't the first time that this has happened. It was a really interesting piece that came out not too long ago, I think in the New York Times Magazine, that sort of moves us historically through some of these challenges with American history. I will say that I'd like to believe that that won't be the case. I think Texas will be an interesting case to see what actually happens with the State Board of Education, because soon we will be revising and revisiting state standards, content standards. I believe that it will likely be a fight and a battle, but it will be interesting to see how this plays out, because in many cases, at least in the state of Texas, as Cedric mentioned, some of the concern or what's being raised is not that we need to necessarily change the topics that are taught. That's come up in, I've heard that in other states, but what's really been focused on in Texas is curriculum that makes students feel uncomfortable, which is a very amorphous thing. And it's not clear what that's going to mean in terms of the curriculum, in terms of the standards that might be taught or not taught, how we know that may play out, how that may play out in actual classroom practice, because teachers are on the front lines. They have to figure out, how am I going to address this? How do I address this if a student feels uncomfortable, or if a parent says that their child feels uncomfortable? But it's not clear yet how those decisions will be made about what curriculum makes students feel uncomfortable, and which students are the ones that we really are concerned about their comfort. Are we concerned about all students? Is it just, in this case, white students? So I don't know. We need to see where that's going to land. But I imagine that we will probably hear about some desired changes in some content that might be taught.
So Cedric,
special program.
So Cedric,
by the African American Initiative, AAI, and the AARP on education censorship.
So Cedric, what do we do? What are the remedies in law? I'm going to come back. This is a double barrel kind of question. What do we do on the legal front? And then I go back to the other two panelists in particular. What do we do on the educational front?
Well, two things. I think one central tenet of critical race theory that we should get on the table to talk about the legal remedy is retrogression and retrenchment. Whenever any progress is made, there is a reaction to undo that policy. And Adrian really underscored this and made an excellent point. Even 18 years after the Civil War, there's a case called the Civil Rights Cases, where you have the Supreme Court basically saying, we're tired of talking about race. I mean, these people were slaves, but so what? There comes a time when a man ceases to be the special favorite of the law. So we don't even really need any race conscious remedies. And that was in 1883. So there's nothing new really under the sun here. I think in terms of legal remedies, we have to push back in terms of the First Amendment. I think that these statutes are patently unconstitutional, and we can demonstrate that on a number of different levels. The state cannot regulate the content of speech. That's unconstitutional strict scrutiny. Even the way that these legislation is drafted is unconstitutional because it's ambiguous, it's overbroad, it's vague, and it chills protected speech that we have to have in schools, like political speech or critical learning. And so whenever you have a statute like that, I think it'll be declared unconstitutional. That really doesn't help us now, but I think there'll have to be some litigation on the constitutionalities of these statutes, and I think that we would win on that front.
So what about educationally? What do we do in the meantime? How are the battle lines drawn, and what do they look like?
One thing, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so I'm a university professor, obviously. I am concerned for my colleagues in states where state legislatures have attempted to restrict any teaching about race or the critical race theory from, on the P20 level. I am concerned about them. My colleagues in state of Ohio actually went to the State House to speak in opposition to a Ohio, someone had introduced some Ohio legislation to restrict CRT, and colleagues organized to go there and speak. So I'm concerned about that, but I do think to Cedric's point is that we have the protections of First Amendment. Supposedly we have academic freedom. I do think, as a daughter of an attorney, that it will take, a lawsuit. Like, this is a lawsuit waiting to. And when I've talked to other colleagues, I think that we should have a legal defense fund. I would hope that the ACLU will pick this up. I don't know if they will, but if not, that there should be a legal defense fund. I think Kim Crenshaw at UCLA, their African American Policy Forum, has been, convened a group to think about kind of what we can do to respond to these things. But I don't think we stop teaching, obviously. I actually teach a course on critical race theory in education. And we read the legal literature. We kind of look at where education policy has, again, helped to reinforce or create, in some ways, racial inequality, where so-called colorblind laws have actually exacerbated racial inequality. So we will continue to do that work. We can be subversive and not call it CRT. We can call it policy analysis. I mean, there are ways to get around it, but I don't think that we stop doing the work and engaging in our research. That is, that's fascist, right? So I think we just have to kind of stand tall and kind of and continue to do the work that we know that is important and critical and has to be done.
So I can say something from the NAACP side. Here in Kentucky, we've had conversations with the education committee statewide, with education chairs and local units, and we prepared a 2-page primer with talking points for members of the organization, for community members, for legislators, and that's ready for folks to take a look at. And just today, I talked with the National NAACP education chairperson, and the National NAACP is also concerned about this issue. And so I think this is one of those places where academics, and I know there's an educator panel coming on, and I know Dr. Lynn, who's an educator, but also an elected official, was on that panel. And then we've got Georgina Bettis, who is an elected state Texas education board member. And so she'll be able to talk to us about ethnic studies, about what she thinks is going to happen with the curriculum. So don't leave us yet. We got a really vibrant conversation still going here.
Well, I have to point out that I think that this is a call for folks to not get lulled into sleep on this issue, that this is not something that we could allow someone to just run down the street with. We have to actually stand up. That's what I'm hearing here. And I agree that whether it's on the legal front, whether it's on the educational front, just think, our kids, all of them are getting educated every day outside the classroom. Social media, you name it, not just at their kitchen table, but social media. And after all, what is the purpose of education itself? I want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to share this information today. It's very important. I'm trusting that I can call upon you in the future, and let's see how this thing is going, and we can make some assessments with respect to that. But I'm really excited to hear what this next panel is going to say in response to what you're saying here, because it actually plays out in the classroom. I'd like to talk to some folks about that. So thank you so much for joining us, and we will be in touch with you again. And Julian, you stay on. We're going to continue with panel number 2, the educators. Thank you so very much. Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right. So that was very educational. That was very that spoke to a lot of issues here. And we have our panel number 2 with respect to this. And we want to now sort of pivot. We talked on the, I guess you might call it the highbrow, the intellectual, the academic area with respect of analyzing this situation. But we have practitioners, we have people actually in their history or in their ability to carrying out their work from day to day as teachers and instructors with us on panel 2. We have with us Catherine Punsley, Verizon Innovative Learning School coach, W.B. Du Bois Academy here in Louisville, Kentucky. We also have Georgina Perez, who is the Texas State Board of Education individual that teaches English and ethnic studies. That's in Texas. I really want to hear how that plays out in Texas. I really want to hear that piece. Then we have Dr. Marvin Lynn. Dr. Marvin Lynn, and Dr. Lynn, a professor at Portland State University, also focused on issues including critical race theory as well. And I understand you've written a book, or you have something that you just done something on that. I want to hear about that too in the course of this discussion. And we have with us Natalie Rashad, who is also an educator at the W.B. Du Bois Academy. We want to make sure that folks understand who and what you are and what the environment is that you're dealing with. So in doing that, I'm going to start with Georgina Perez. Georgina, would you please, if you don't mind me referring to you that way, would you please tell our viewing and listening audience exactly what your environment is, what your issues are, and what you do as it relates to education?
Yes, and thank you. What I do on the State Board of Education is predominantly our responsibilities are setting curriculum standards, reviewing and adopting instructional materials. So in layman's terms, the bare minimum of what teachers must teach, what students must learn, and then the instructional materials, pedagogical tools that go along with that. We also oversee the testing system and establish the graduation requirements. Some of the issues that we have right now as it pertains to CRT is, like you said in your previous panel, there are about 30 states that have already passed this. Texas is one of those, and they're not calling it CRT. The bill itself does not mention the acronym CRT, does not say the terms critical race theory. What it does say, however, is teaching that white supremacy is bad is prohibited. Teaching about anything under the umbrella of LGBTQ or women or people of color has been scratched through. There's strike through in the prescriptive legislation that was just passed out of the most recent special session at the Texas legislature. And so however people define critical race theory, whether it's the way we define it at the American Bar Association, or how Encyclopedia Britannica defines it, doesn't really matter, because what CRT has become is equity, diversity, inclusion, cultural competence, social justice, or restorative practices. If you can't say teaching anything about the 1619 Project is now prohibited. Quite a few women, particularly the suffragettes, were also stricken out. And so while all of this political theater is taking place at the legislature across the street with us at the State Board of Education, we voted to rearrange the calendar. We were not scheduled to review and adopt new standards or adopt new instructional materials on social studies until the year 2025. Well, we are starting in 2021, and the law now requires that we're done with the standards and instructional materials by the end of 2022. And so if there were to be any kind of legislation, if there were to be any kind of lawsuits that requires a legislative revision, it will be too late. The Texas legislature doesn't return until 2023. And by then, we will already have spent an enormous amount of taxpayer dollars to make all of these legally required revisions. And so what does that mean? The law in Texas says it's not just about how students feel uncomfortable in our history courses or our social studies courses. It's the comfort or the prohibited discomfort of students in any content area in K-12. They're also going as far as to remove books that cause any kind of discomfort from our school library selections. And so knowing that this legislation lives as long as the next group of legislators goes into office to change it. And if they don't change it, then our standards last for a minimum of 10 years. The instructional materials will be in our students' hands for approximately 10 years. Yeah. What does that look like for that entire generation? And so my question is very much like the previous panel. When we're talking about the comfort or discomfort of students, in my lifetime, as a student in K-12, as a teacher in 8th grade, and as an elected state official on the Board of Education for the state of Texas, no one has ever questioned the comfort of Native Americans when we talk about the Trail of Tears. No one has ever mentioned the comfort of Mexican American students when we talk about the Texas Rangers and the hanging trees. No one mentions the comfort of our Black students when we're talking about enslaved people and slavery for hundreds of years, segregated schools, Jim Crow, redlining, green books. And if we take it even further, are we going to start talking about the unbiased lessons on 9/11? Because the law requires our teachers to teach both sides without giving deference to any one side in any content area. So that includes the Holocaust, that includes the Civil War, that includes the Revolution. And so our teachers are now asking, number one, how do we do that? And number two, the law also requires us to believe that our students don't know any better. And so when our students are taking the state required tests to receive their high school diplomas, are we going to require that they lie in their responses for fear that their high school diplomas will be withheld? Nobody wants to have these conversations.
You say something here that's very important, because I was just here thinking, how does a student prepare himself for post-secondary education? How does a student prepare themselves for a broader world that is real, that's out there, that they're learning, they're understanding how to maneuver the terrain, yet we are suppressing, censoring education and our own educational system. Dr. Lynn. if I may call you Marvin, it's okay. What's your take on that in terms of your experience? You have experience in the study of critical race theory, but what we're really talking about here is censorship. We talk censorship and education suppression.
Absolutely. And thank you for having this important and necessary conversation about, both the theory and the practice of critical race theory. As you indicated, I work as a scholar, and I've also worked as a leader, as a dean in higher education for the last decade. And you mentioned my scholarly work with Dr. Dickson. The Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education is something that we think you should pick up, because it sort of responds to, I think, some of the challenges that we're talking about. Let me comment on a question you asked before, Senator Neal. You asked the question, why are they so able to redefine the conversation without a very focused response? And I think, and it gets at what you're talking about in terms of censorship. In the fall of 2020, Trump issued an executive order essentially banning the discussion of racism and sexism in public institutions, if you remember that. That was authored by Christopher Rufo, who is a conservative activist and writer for conservative publications. And he, since then, has been working through ALEC to author templates for proposed legislation at the state level. So the legislation that's been proposed in Kentucky, I took a look at that. It is the same language that is in that executive order that was rescinded by Biden in January of this year. So what Rufo and colleagues have been doing is developing a slick marketing campaign that appeals to the average person, right? And essentially what it does, you can go on YouTube and find these videos very easily, very quickly. In fact, if you go to YouTube and you type in, what is critical race theory, what you'll see are Rufo's videos, which are 1 minute, 2 minutes. They have music attached to them. And what they've done is rebrand critical race theory into something very dangerous, very scary. It doesn't at all speak to what we've been talking about on this panel in terms of the legal understandings of critical race theory. So that is how they have gotten the public so scared and whipped up around critical race theory. And they have also been engaged in actually writing legislation that has been disseminated all across the country. And as you mentioned, 26, 28 different states have proposed this. And it is law in Texas and Idaho, which is close to where I am, and so on. So we see a level of activism on the conservative side, which is not unprecedented, right? And I think, as Julian said earlier, CRT is the boogeyman, so to speak. It is the welfare quota queen. Remember the welfare queen from the 80s and Willie Horton from the 70s, right? So we always have to have a racial boogeyman to sort of whip up fear, particularly on the right, to get people to go to the polls and vote what they consider to be against the thing that they are fearful of. I want to say one other thing. That there was a question about what activist efforts there are on the left to address some of this, and there's a lot going on. The ACLU is right now involved in a lawsuit against the state of Oklahoma, and that is challenging the Oklahoma Classroom Censorship Bill, HB 1775, which severely restricts public school teachers and students from learning about what? Race, right? So, and I've been involved in submitting expert testimony for that case. The African American Policy Forum, I think Adrian mentioned, is holding weekly conversations with educators, with scholars, with people who are out there on the front lines fighting against this. And they have a whole political and legal strategy that they are working hand in hand with the NEA, which is the National Education Association. The National Education Association has an honest education movement that is moving forward, that supports teachers who are trying to teach about race and who are being excoriated or they feel like they're being attacked in their classrooms. And then the AAUP is out front on this as well to defend the academic freedom of faculty. So there's a lot going on. I think that the right has beat us, though, in terms of developing those slick marketing campaigns that appeal to the average person. And so if anything needs to happen now, it's that we need to be talking about democracy, freedom, and justice, and how this is tied to the limitation of that with the average person.
Before we move on, we're getting ready to lose our audience in our simulcast. WLOU Radio 1350, that's 104.7 radio here in Louisville, Kentucky. We want to thank them for joining in and hope that they can appreciate some of this conversation, particularly because it's in my community. And we want to make sure that everyone is up to par in terms of that, which leads me now to turn to Catherine Punsley. Now we have two, Catherine Punsley and Natalie Richard, experienced educators with unique experiences in education. But what I really want to get into here, and I'm gonna start with you, Catherine, is your experience. Will you reflect, or will you give the viewing audience the type of experience educationally you have, what it takes to prepare for that, and also what you've experienced in terms of your classroom when you're teaching race or something related to the racialism in America?
Yeah, so I think something that would surprise a lot of people is that, in our contract as teachers, it says that we cannot have a political platform. Teachers are not out there sharing their political views. Teachers are not out there espousing one way or another. We have, all the falsehoods about indoctrinating children are greatly exaggerated, right? If you've ever tried to convince a middle schooler of one thing, they'll say the opposite, but what we do is we teach children the critical thinking faculty, right? And so when we have these discussions, I know that I'm not going to say what my political views are, and I'm not going to tell a child one way or the other, but I know that we can, ask probing questions. We can help them think deeper and push back against their thinking and help them bring up new evidence and see if their views change in the light of evidence. And what that sort of does is sort of hone in their skills and, really develop their abilities. And so as that sort of process happens, you have those really rich conversations. And it's okay for students to say that, right? It's okay for students to reach the conclusions about race that they do, right? Usually unprompted by us. Usually they come in with their lived experiences and they draw on that and they're trying to make sense of it. And the frameworks that we give them and the questions that we pose help sort of sharpen their thinking. I will say that I personally, as a teacher of multilingual learners, of students who are newcomers, who have only lived, in America as immigrants or refugees for a few years, have really seen these interesting perspectives, because you have these students who weren't raised with American history and weren't raised in the context of race in America, and they're sort of plopped into the situation and they've missed everything that's happened, in the past 400 some years, and so they are sort of, you have these African students who have never necessarily thought of themselves as Black in a pejorative sense, and then on day one, they're treated by white teachers in a particular way the second they walk in the door, right? And they don't even recognize it. They just go about their day and they go on. And then the longer they are in the system, you start to see those students who are quote unquote fresh off the boat start to assimilate and behave like all the other students, like they're getting a sort of fast track history. And it's very painful. I think that there's a lot we could do in terms of explicitly teaching our history and making sure that folks understand both the beautiful and the painful parts, so that students really understand how it is we got here, right? And especially for those who are sort of plopped into the middle of it. But I really have had an amazing time seeing things through that lens, as a child of an immigrant myself. And so it's been an amazing experience working with those students.
Well, thank you for that. So Natalie, you have, and along with Catherine, a very unique experience. You've taught in K-12, I think particularly middle, in a particular context, the traditional context, but you both now are also teaching in the Jefferson County Public Schools systems in educational context that specifically deals with the supports and the cultural supports, not just the academic and educational supports of students of color, African Americans in particular, in this particular context, I would suspect. Could you elaborate on that? First, your overall teaching experience, and along with what the impacts have been, talking about race on that level, and what's happening in the current context that you're in.
Yes, absolutely. So I spent the majority of my career, like you said, in a demographic situation that was what you would expect from your average public school. Majority white and minority, other ethnicities, African American, and et cetera. And what I found is that all of our students come to public education with their family histories, and their parents have done a really excellent job, exposing them to what led them to where they are today. But they are hungry for knowledge of other cultures and what the full tapestry of America truly is. And so as professional educators, that's our responsibility, to teach all of the students about the full history of America and of various cultures. Now, at the W.E.B. Du Bois Academy, where I teach now, which is a school that is majority minority, right? It is a school that is predominantly males of color. Yes, the students still come with that same thirst for knowledge of all cultures, but we have a special responsibility to put in those things that were often overlooked in public education. A lot of our young men have not learned about the fullness of their history and who they are, and that caused a real disconnect, a real disenfranchisement with public education. And so it's really important to fill in those gaps, and that they know that our history did not begin with slavery in America. I know that sometimes we hear that we began as kings and queens, and it's not just something that we tell our students in a generic way. There is a deep, rich history that we've been missing as a community. And so it's really frightening when we see, this legislation and this movement that is aimed at suppressing the fullness of the history that our students so deeply need. There are a lot of times when you hear about the achievement gap, but the achievement gap is not really about an inability for our students to achieve. It's about a lack of engagement, that they don't feel that these systems, that our public education systems are built for them. They don't feel that these systems are intended for them to succeed, and definitely that these systems don't reflect them, either their history, or that they can look at the teachers in front of them in many cases and see people who reflect them. So it's very important that, that our histories are represented, and that, I know in the previous discussion, it came out about, will this anti-CRT movement push educators of color out of the profession? And I absolutely believe that it will. As a person who has worked extensively to recruit minority educators, I know that part of the passion as a minority educator is to open up doors for our children that have historically been closed. And so when we let legislation silence our voices, not only do we close the hearts and minds of our children and our communities, but we push professional educators of color out of our systems.
Wow, well, thank you. Julian, why don't you step in here?
Yeah, incredible contributions by you folks. I got an email from an educator in Georgia, and apparently a district had blocked a certain set of brain pop videos. These are curriculum materials that are used often by teachers On this list was these things, and I'll just do a quick few of them. AIDS, Black Lives Matter protests, Brown versus Board, Harvey Milk, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Holocaust, Jim Crow, North Korea, slavery, substance abuse, terrorism, Trail of Tears, Tulsa Race Massacre, Wounded Knee Massacre, civil rights, Muhammad Ali. These are topics that the district banned teachers from having access to. Like, this is real specific. So, and this is based on complaints related to the CRT law in that state. Just popcorning this, what do you all think are the real world implications of this type of censorship of topics like these in schools?
I'll start off by saying I have taught that Muhammad Ali brain pop video in my class, and my Muslim students love it. It means so much to them to see someone who shares their religion. I think I've also taught the Barack Obama video, and some of the students who I guess don't pick up on the political cues that well were very, very disappointed to find out that President Obama was not Muslim. They were like very convinced he was, and they felt so represented by him. But I had to disabuse them of that notion, unfortunately. But they were very convinced, and they were very excited about that. But that's how starved for representation some of our students are. They never get to see someone who represents their religion, and it's even just the rumor of it means the world to them, right? And so getting to see folks like them in a video like that, it really means the world. And so, those kinds of resources, they are accessible. They're, usually pretty well crafted, kid friendly. Taking away that stuff means that teachers either have to not teach that topic or spend a lot more time and resources developing it.
I agree with what was said earlier. I think this is unconstitutional. I think that the legislature, I would say legislatures are out of line here. It is not their role to determine what gets taught in schools. They hire state superintendents and their state boards of education who get to make those decisions. And so I think what impact, I absolutely agree with Natalie and others who talk about the impact that this will have on the diversification of the profession. As Natalie said so well, my research also shows that Black male teachers in particular get into teaching because they want the opportunity to use the classroom as a space for teaching a liberatory curriculum. And how do you teach a liberatory curriculum? It is culturally responsive, it is culturally sustaining, it is honest about our history. And so when you are limited and not able to do that, that is absolutely going to be a turnoff for teachers of color. And we're going to see that population pretty decimated. That's one impact. The other impact, I think, is very serious in terms of when you start eliminating these important topics from the curriculum. What you are doing is you are not only dumbing down the curriculum, you're making the curriculum inaccurate. And you are miseducating an entire generation of young people who are unfortunately not going to have the tools of critical analysis so that they can really be active participants in this democracy. And talk about being underprepared for college. I mean, we're already starting to see serious gaps in terms of the knowledge and understanding that kids would have. In fact, the court case that I talked about in Oklahoma, the professors are making that argument very well that, listen, if you eliminate these topics from the curriculum in K-12, they're not going to be prepared to take the literary criticism courses and so on in college. And so it is going to have, I think, a very damaging impact on teaching and teachers as well as students.
Georgina?
If anybody is concerned about what the chilling effect might be, we've already seen it. We have schools and programs all across the state that are canceling government projects. In the state of Texas, it's no longer allowable for teachers to award credit for any kind of civic engagement. We've already had trustees attack teachers from a school board meeting from the days when we all know that trustees, local school board trustees are not supposed to get involved in the day-to-day business, hence the reason they hire a school superintendent. We've seen a principal fired. We've seen parents going to school boards begging the trustees to disallow Mexican-American studies or African-American studies because they're convinced that it's filled with CRT. And the moment that anybody asks, okay, what is CRT? Find it in the standards for me. Silence. Silence. So they don't know what CRT is. They can't define it very well. They're reading from the Tea Party Patriots, how to attack your local board, school board, or how to attack your state board of education. And they're doing all of this ultimately to have a complete whitewashing of history, because they don't care that Black and brown students are uncomfortable. They don't care that Muslim students are uncomfortable. They don't care that Jewish students are uncomfortable. They just want to make sure that white students know about the wonderful contributions of other white people. And the danger there is when that's the only thing that's taught. Not only is it disenfranchising to white students because they don't get to the benefit of being able to learn from the mistakes of others, it also completely erases all of the beautiful contributions by any other human beings, which it is definitely a disadvantage for all students. But the chilling effect is already here.
You know, if I may, the irony of this is that if that's successful, this attack on what this whole piece about education censorship is successful, just think about it. Those very same students are going to get educated. They're going to get educated by a world that's wrapped around them that they're going to engage and interact with and not be prepared to handle. It's sort of it's sort of amazing. We don't have a children problem. It seems that there's an adult problem with respect to what we talked about here, and they're dumbing down the same individuals that they profess to want to support. What do you think about it? It seems like there's a conflict in terms of what they're trying to achieve and what is actually happening in terms of their objectives.
Absolutely. You know, one thing that really surprised me when a lot of my students came in is they had clearly been told by previous, English language learner teachers not to speak their native language in class. Like they had been told repeatedly, it's not appropriate, you need to speak English only, like that's the way that you learn. And, and they started, and when it came to my class where all languages are welcome and, sharing your language is encouraged, they were still policing each other, right? And so you see that effect of all these sort of xenophobic things coming out, paranoia about people speaking their own language. Are they talking about me? And that sort of thing happens because of adults who had set that up. And so rather than uplifting cultures, showing appreciation for other cultures, showing that we welcome all of those differences, we have adults who have modeled things and made it seem like things that are people's cultural identity is fundamentally bad, and that is so easily internalized by young people.
So Natalie, given this, you teach before you went to Du Bois in particular, you were teaching white students and Black students. What value do you see they received by how you were teaching and educational systems teaching on that level? I think you're talking about middle school. And withholding that information, what damage do you think results from that in your experience?
Well, there's a huge gap that is left when we as professional educators are not there to fill in the missing pieces for our students, whether they're white students or Black students or from any other background. So you have students that are coming to you with very limited experiences. Like you said, my area of expertise is in middle school. So we're talking about 11, 12, 13-year-old kids. Their life experiences are so very narrow. Without us as professionals, they would not know. They would not know what they're missing out on. And I think that the beauty of public education is that the wealth of knowledge is not limited to those who have status, right? That's what has made America great, is that when we have a high quality public education system, then every student has access to that knowledge. They're not just limited to the narrow scope of their experiences. And so I think that as a public educator, it is our responsibility to give them the full spectrum of what the world is, of the different cultures, the different histories. And so it doesn't just do a disservice to those whose cultures are not being taught. It also does a huge disservice to those whose culture are being taught, because when they go out into the world and they try to interact on this global marketplace that we live in today, they're going to be at a disadvantage, because even though we have these initiatives going on here in the United States, that is not the learning environment across the globe. And we're living in a global economy where our students need to become competitors across the world. They're not having these CRT issues in Asian countries and in European countries. And so when we go out and we try to be competitive, our students need to have the full spectrum of knowledge so that they can truly be competitive.
Julian?
Well, I know we asked this question of the last panel, and I think Dr. Lin talked about this a little bit, but there are probably people listening to this podcast or this lecture or this conversation, this panel conversation, wondering, what should I do? What should I do next? What would you recommend to that person that's listening right now? Look, I'm convinced this is a challenge. This is a problem. This is an issue. What do you recommend to them that they do today, tomorrow, next week? What's your recommendation?
Well, part of the reason, Julian, I think you asked me to be on this panel, even though I have a lot in common with the previous panel, Adrian Dickson and I are co-editing the handbook and so on. But I also serve as a school board member. And so like the educators here and the leaders, other educational leaders here, I'm also directly engaged with teachers, with superintendents, and with other school board members and community members around a whole host of issues, including this issue around CRT and the perception that people have that CRT is in the schools. And I can tell you, I think Senator Neal, you're onto something. There's a gap in understanding around these issues between the parents and the students. So a lot of times you have parents coming into school boards advocating and arguing for a certain thing that their students do not agree with at all, right? So they're not coming in representing the views of or the feelings of their students. These are their political beliefs that they are, and they're connected to these grassroots conservative organizations that are telling them exactly what to say. What can be done? I think that we need more engagement, more activism on the left. The left hasn't been, in my view, and I work with the Democratic Party here in my state, and I've shared with them, I don't think we've been very organized in terms of thinking about the strategies that we need to adopt to ensure that the platform is understood by the average individual. I think we can be too highbrow and very disconnected from the average individual, and sometimes say things that are offensive to poor people, right? And particularly poor white people. And so we have to be very, very careful about the language that we use. I think we can talk about racial equity and those things and make it about democracy and about advancing freedom in ways that I think speak to the broader citizens. So I say get involved at the local level, with your progressive political party. There are ways to do that. Every state usually has a state party as well as county parties or city parties. I would also say support your school boards. School boards are under attack. Most of the people that we see, and Oregon is a progressive state, so we don't have legislation like Texas, right? Or like what's being proposed in Kentucky. But even in a progressive state, we are constantly under a barrage of attacks from people on the right who are demanding that there be no masks in schools and that we stop teaching CRT. We do not hear enough from folks on the left. So I would say people need to write to their school board supporting racial equity and supporting good, culturally responsive instruction. And if we did those two things, I think we'd be going a long way.
So what about parents? What do parents do? How do we reach parents? How do you educate those individuals, whether they white, black, or any other ethnic derivation? How do you go about that without being intrusive, with being respectful, but at the same time sharing information that's essential to their child's future?
I think one of the easiest ways to do that is when we speak to our young people that are in high school, because they are the next leaders, right? Not only do we have to make sure that those young people are prepared for whatever they decide to do after they graduate high school, but every day in increasing amounts, we have students that are in IB courses, in AP courses, dual credit courses, early college, high school courses. And in order for a teacher to teach the required laws, they must be out of compliance with education code, or vice versa. But both things cannot be true at the same time. And so for that group of young people who are either, they know for sure they're going to college, or they're already in early college, high school courses, that's the easiest place to start the conversation. But I will say this, despite the fact that it's a very loud group of parents who are perhaps controlling the narrative right now, there are groups of parents all across the state that are attending school board meetings, that are pushing back and saying, we understand that you don't want your child to know ABC, but we want our children to learn the complete history, the complete literature, the complete, math, science, etc. And as soon as one person stands up, it makes it so much easier for everyone else to stand up. It takes that one brave soul to provide the resistance and meaningful, effective resistance. And sometimes that just looks like, thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thank you for sharing your opinion. However, public education is for the public good. If you want to dictate and control what your children read, there are options for that. There are schools where you can do that. But the public education paid by the taxpayers includes all of us, and the education will include all of us. So take a seat.
Well, Julian, you have the last round here. We're approaching the end of this exchange. Bring us on in.
So I just want to thank panel one that had so many scholars, and panel two, folks that are out there in the classroom, folks that are elected officials. This is, I think, one of the most important conversations that we're having in education right now. Yes, in the big picture, it's about critical race theory, but I think what it's really about is censorship. It's about, can we teach themes of equity and diversity in our K-12 schools and our higher education schools, or can legislators and small groups of agitators determine what history is taught? I think this is an important question for our democracy. I mentioned earlier that when you see autocratic and totalitarian regimes, this is part of their playbook. So I think that it's important that we protect public education because it really is truly the compass of our democracy. And without that compass, we will lose our way.
Well said. So let me sum it up just a little bit. Let's make it clear. Here's what I'm hearing. Racial equity is not synonymous with critical race theory, first of all. It's been misappropriated. That a lot of the legislation that's out here have created education police, has a chilling effect, it reflects big government intervention, and more critically, it tamps down the critical thinking skills of our youth. To be competitive in the nation, the world, in all fields of endeavor, competitive in business world, this is what they are calling on. It depreciates the skills and training of our educators. It depreciates the intellect and capabilities of our youth. So this reaction, which is really not new historically, after every appearance of progress, there's a counter push. And we're in that the throes of that right now. Unfortunately, at this time in history, it's on our watch. And the question is, what are we going to do? I want to thank each and every one of our contributors to this conversation. Dr. Adrian D. Dickson, Professor Cedric Powell, Dr. Kathleen Brown, who populated our first panel, and our second panelists, Catherine Punsley, Georgina Perez, Marvin Lynn, Dr. Marvin Lynn, Natalie Richard. I want to put another plug in because I'm going to get that book, Dr. Lynn. I'm going to get that book because I'm not going to close my eyes to what's going on in this world. I want to encourage you that are listening to not just take in what's being said here, but actually learn from this and get engaged in this process. I also want to thank AAI, of which I'm part of, the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. Have special thank you to the Louisville Alumni Chapter of the Delta Sigma Theta Incorporated, as well as AARP and WLOU Radio for their collaboration in this matter. We will be revisiting this issue. AAI and its other partners and co-conveners are responsible for promoting and reaching out to you. So we want you to stay close to this issue. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much. And God bless you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.